Hello everyone, welcome to HIM 216. This will be the first of several lectures covering Chapter 3 in your textbook. This is a very important chapter. Basically, this chapter covers the first part of the coding guidelines for ICD-10. Basically, when we talk about guidelines, we're talking about rules. What are the rules that we have to go by in assigning codes? And if we don't follow the rules, there can be some serious consequences for our organizations. In order to demonstrate these guidelines to you, I am logging in to 3M. And if you actually go to the, if you have completed the tutorial, the assignment, the first assignment for Chapter 3, which is the tutorial, you will have logged in. But also, if you go to web links in the course, you'll find a link to 3M. You can see the URL up here, http://3m.ahima.org. Now, once you get to the website, it asks you to log in, and the username for when you log in, and this is in the tutorial and in the link, is GVL001, and that's a 0, not an O, so 001, or GVL002. And I'm going to come down in patient identification and so GVL00100, not O, excuse me. And then the password is, and this password actually will change around the 1st of August. You have to repurchase the virtual lab in the fall, and the password will change. And the password now is AHIMA#88, and that's all capital letters. And if you press the cap lock key and you type in the password, you have to release the cap lock key, or for some reason it won't let you log in, and I'm not really sure why, but that's been my experience. You can press the cap lock and then type in AHIMA#88, but then release the cap lock. When you do, this is the page that will come up for you. And this particular page is the entryway for the encoder and the grouper. And we're not going to be using the encoder this semester, and we will just we will use the grouper, but not to any degree, because actually you really don't start coding until chapters 8 and 9. We will do some coding, some PCS coding, but the grouper is designed for input of a diagnosis code and a procedure code. Now, to get into the integrated code book, we're going to click on this book that has a 10 on it. I want you to notice that there is a stack of books here. These are references, which we will go over later. This DX is actually for ICD-9 codes. Now, I want you to be very careful here. We're not studying ICD-9. We are studying ICD-10. So don't make a mistake and click on the DX book and then look up codes for ICD-10. Make sure that you're clicking on this red book that has a 10 on top of it so that you get into ICD-10. And then Coding Clinic, which is a reference tool, is this green book. You can also get to it through the references. And then this blue book is CPT Assistant, which you can also get to through the references. If we click on the references, we have a number of tools. These are all excellent. From this tool, we can actually get into the I-9 or the I-10 integrated code book and into the CPT code book. As I've stated in previous lectures, these integrated code books are actually the equivalent of e-books. They're used exactly the same way as a paper book. Coding procedural terminology is a little different, and actually we don't use this electronic code book when we teach CPT and HIM 141. We have you buy the paper book because we think that it's easier to use. You learned in Chapter 1 that official guidance for I-9 and I-10 is published by the American Hospital Association. There are actually references in the code book to Coding Clinic, and this is how you can actually click on the links from the code book, or you can click on this link to get into it. And then we have CPT Assistant, and that's a tool for, that's the kind of the equivalent to the Coding Clinic for CPT coding. And then you can see what the rest of these tools are, and I would suggest that at some point in time you take the time to go through and look through these different references that you have. You have a medical dictionary so that you can look terms up. You have a PDR so that you can look up medications. We have Elsevier anatomy plates, which our students have told us are better than the plates they had when they were taking biology. There is a Merck manual here, and the Merck manual is a wonderful manual that basically gives you information about disease processes. So if you're ever wondering if some condition is integral to another, you can go to the Merck manual and you can look them up. I'm going to code that, and from this screen I'm going to click on the 10 to get me into the integrated code book. And I'm going to make this screen big, and I want to point some things out to you. You see there are these A's up here, text to display, so you can choose the size of your font. I always choose the largest font. We're going to be working today in the diagnosis tab. There are other tabs here. There's a tab for drugs, which we certainly will cover. This is the external cause, index, and tabular. There is a neoplasm table that we will be using extensively in Chapter 10. The procedures, this is the procedural coding system. It has its own index and its own tabular. Today we're going to be starting in the diagnosis tab as we go over the structure of these two chapters. The index is exactly what it sounds like. It is an alphabetical index of diseases. It's on the left side of your screen. On the right side of your screen is the tabular, and this is actually an alphanumeric listing of codes, and it's broken down by chapter. If I click up here on the number 1, I can see all 21 chapters that are in ICD-10. The process for identifying a code is actually to look it up alphabetically in the index, find your code, and verify it in the tabular. For instance, I am going to look up the code for pneumonia. So all I have to do is begin typing in pneumonia, and you can see that I don't even have to type out the entire term before I come to pneumonia. And these terms that are in parenthesis are called non-essential modifiers, which means that when they are combined with pneumonia, they do not affect the code. So the code for acute pneumonia is J18.9. The code for double pneumonia is J18.9. Septic pneumonia is J18.9. This code, J18.9, is called a default code. So it is, the pneumonia is bolded, it's in black, and it's bolded, and it is a main term. When I click on this code, J18.9, you see that it takes me to the tabular, and it highlights this code for me in the, let me scroll down. Hold on just a second. Okay. So it highlights this code for me in the tabular, J18.9. Excuse me. And if I scroll up, I can see that my category is J18, pneumonia, unspecified organism, and these codes this code in red, J18, this code is in red because it wants you to think about stop. This is not a valid code. It's a 3-digit code, but it's not a valid code. This is called a category. J18 is the category. J18.0 is a subcategory. This code is in blue, so this is a valid code, just as our code J18.9 is. This is a code that I can assign. Now I also want you to notice that we have instructional notes in this tabular. We have a note here that says code first associated influenza if applicable, and it gives me a code range for that. I can actually click on these codes and go to those particular categories. But basically this is telling me if my patient has the flu, I code the flu first and then I code the pneumonia. In this particular category, we have an excludes one note. And an excludes one note basically says you can't code any of these diagnoses on the same chart with any code from category J18. And I know that because this note is listed right under J18. So I know that it applies to every code that begins with J18. So it applies to J18.0, .1, .2, .8, and .9. Now also, if I look under J18.0, I have an excludes note 1 here. This particular excludes one note only applies to this code J18.0 because it's listed under J18.0. So if my patient has hypostatic bronchopneumonia, that code is J18.2, and I cannot have the code J18.0 on the same chart, the same account, as code J18.2. J18.2 is more specific. It is a specific kind of bronchopneumonia. So I can't have these codes on the same chart. Also, we have an excludes note 2 listed under J18.0. This only applies to J18.0. It doesn't apply to .1 or .2 because it's under J18.0. And this excludes note 2 tells me that if my patient also has acute bronchiolitis, I need to go ahead and apply that code because it's not included with J18.0. So unlike the excludes note 1, which I can't have this code, the J18.0, and either of these codes on the same chart, with excludes 2, it's basically telling me, okay, if your patient has either of these conditions, go ahead and code them and add those codes, because those conditions are not included with J18.0. I'm going to move this bar back up. Okay, try not to choose anything that's going to be at the very bottom. So going back to the beginning of the alphabetical index, and actually in your book on page 53, your textbook first begins talking about the structure of the tabular. The right side of your screen is the tabular, and we're going to go to chapter 1. The tabular is organized around chapters, and we looked at those, chapter 1 through chapter 21. Then within each chapter, there are sections. And if I click on this first section, intestinal infectious diseases, I can see that I have a list of categories. And if I click on the categories, I will find subcategories. Let's go through here and see if we can find some. Yes. So the category is cholera. The category code for cholera is A00. This code is in red. It is not a complete code. We must code to the greatest specificity. So we know that within this category we need a 4-digit code, and it's going to have to be one of the 3 that is listed here. Now I'm going to click this green down arrow, and it's going to take me to the next category. And we can see that this category, that within this category we have a 3-digit category code A01. Then we have a subcategory A01.0. That's a 4-digit code. But there are further subcategories in this particular category. These are 5-digit codes, A01.00. So if you'll recall, when we were at cholera, we had 4-digit codes that were blue, and those were perfectly complete and accurate codes. But when we're looking at typhoid and paratyphoid fever, these 4-digit codes are not complete codes. We have to go to 5-digit codes. And so we may find categories. Let's see if I can actually find a category. That's 3 digits. Okay. Category A09, infectious gastroenteritis and colitis unspecified. This is a 3-digit code, A09. That is the same code of the category. So this is a complete code, even though it is only 3 characters. I want you to look on page 48 and 49 in your book. And actually beginning on the first page of the chapter, which is 47. This text that has the green background, these are actually the coding guidelines and conventions. And if we look on page 49, we can see that section 1 is the conventions, the general coding guidelines, and chapter-specific guidelines. Section 1 is probably, in reality, about 112, maybe 100 pages, 100 to 110 or 12 pages in length. If we actually look at the paper printed coding guidelines, and actually within the course, under course syllabus and course information, you have the 2016 coding guidelines. It's a PDF. You can open it up and you can see how long those coding guidelines are. The biggest chunk of the coding guidelines is actually chapter-specific guidelines. And so these guidelines have been broken down, and the chapters in your textbook correspond to the chapters in ICD-10, and then the guidelines are also broken down to correspond to those specific chapters. So what we're doing initially is we're looking at the conventions and the general coding guidelines. The chapter-specific coding guidelines will actually start in your textbook in chapter 8. Now, if we look at number 2, which is format and structure, it basically goes over what I have been telling you. Subcategories can be 4 or 5 characters. Codes in ICD-10 can be up to 7 characters in length. In the clinical modification in ICD-10-CM, valid complete codes can be anywhere from 3 to 7 characters in length. That's not the case in PCS, and we'll talk about that when we're studying Chapter 6. But we have to apply the code, the most complete code. The way that you know that, by using the tabular, and you can't rely on the codes in the index. Sometimes the codes in the index will have a little dash after the code to alert you to the fact that you need to go to the tabular to assign that complete code. However, sometimes there are codes, many times, not sometimes, many times, there are codes in the index that don't have a dash and they're not a complete code. So you always, you must find the code in the index, click on it, and then verify it in the tabular. Always. That's what you always must do. Let me... So if I look in at this code, D. Juligmio's disease. Do you see this dash after this code C94.0? When I see that dash, I know immediately that I must verify that code in the tabular. And in fact, when I click on that code, it takes me to a category code, and I can see that it is red, and so that I know that I must then review the narrative description of these 3 codes within that category to choose the most correct code. So that's what the dash looks like. But just because a code doesn't have a dash, you can't assume that it is the most complete code. Also on page 49, number 4, it tells you that X is used as a placeholder, and the best way to demonstrate this is to go to the injury and poisoning section. Let's see. Now when I want you to look at these codes. This is category S64, injuries of nerves. And as we look down this category, all of these codes are red. How are we ever supposed to find the code that is blue, that is accurately the most specific code that we can use? And you can see that this code is 5 characters. It's not 7 characters, it's 5 characters. And when I read this instructional note, it says the appropriate 7th character is to be added to each code. And these codes are like initial encounter, subsequent encounter, and sequela. What I actually have to do is I have to click on one of these codes, and if I click on that code, then this box opens up and it shows me that I have an X as a placeholder. So my code is S64.00, and then I have a placeholder for X, which is the 6th character, and then I add my 7th character to indicate initial encounter. If this were subsequent, my 7th character would be a D. If it were a sequela, my 7th character would be an S. And so I can do that consistently throughout this particular category. And this is not, we'll see this consistently for fractures and injuries. Again, this is an injury of a blood vessel at the wrist and hand level. All red codes. A note about my 7th character. Well, I look at these codes. This actually happens to be a 6-digit code, S65.001. And if this is my initial encounter, I should be able to add an A to that and have a complete code. And in fact, when I click on that, I can see that that is exactly the scenario for this particular code. And we'll, of course, work with this much, much more. Now, I'm going to end the lecture here, and when we come back, we'll begin talking about the abbreviations on the bottom of page 49. And so your question for this lecture is to define for me the difference in an excludes one and an excludes two note. So an excludes one and an excludes two, and you'll remember that when we looked at chapter 1 and we looked at some of the different categories. I think it was 09 that we looked at. Nope, it wasn't 09. Your textbook also covers the difference in an excludes one and an excludes two. And so that's your question for this lecture, is to define for me the difference in those two.